Picture a caveman. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine one. Chances are the image that appears is strangely familiar. A muscular man with tangled hair and an enormous beard, animal skins hanging loosely from his shoulders, a crude wooden club dragging behind him. He grunts instead of speaking. He lives inside a dark cave. His days are spent chasing mammoths, fighting saber-toothed cats, and barely surviving another sunrise. It's an image so deeply embedded in our culture that we rarely stop to question it. Movies use it, cartoons exaggerate it, advertisements parody it, even children's books repeat it. For more than a century, this has been our mental picture of prehistoric humans. But almost every part of it is wrong. The biggest lie about cavemen isn't a single mistake. It's an entire story we've told ourselves. Because the people who lived tens of thousands of years ago weren't simply primitive versions of us. In many ways, they already were us. The strange thing about myths is that they don't need to be completely false. They only need one true detail. Take dragons. No one has ever discovered a flying reptile that breathes fire. But giant reptiles did exist. Now imagine someone thousands of years later finding dinosaur bones scattered across a mountainside. Without modern science, dragons suddenly don't seem like such an impossible explanation. The same thing happened with cavemen. Real prehistoric humans existed. Some really did enter caves. Some even painted on cave walls. But from those few facts, an entire fictional character was created. And once that character entered popular culture, it became almost impossible to erase. Ironically, the word caveman isn't even an archaeological term. Scientists don't classify ancient humans as cavemen. They talk about Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, and many other human relatives. Each lived during different periods, each adapted differently, each occupied different environments. Lumping all of them together under a single nickname is a bit like calling every modern person apartment people. Technically, many people live in apartments, but billions don't. The label hides more than it reveals. Caveman does exactly the same thing. So where did this image come from? Oddly enough, from archaeology itself. During the 19th century, Europe became fascinated with humanity's distant past. Railroads cut through hillsides. Quarries exposed ancient rock layers. Miners stumbled across strange bones. Inside caves, researchers began finding something remarkable. Stone tools, animal bones, ash from ancient fires, human skeletons. The deeper they dug, the older everything became. For the first time, people realized that humans had existed unimaginably long before written history. These discoveries were revolutionary, but they also created an illusion, because caves preserve history unusually well. Imagine dropping your phone into the middle of a forest. Leave it there for 20,000 years. Rain falls, plants grow, roots break it apart, soil buries it, animals disturb it. Eventually, almost nothing remains. Now imagine placing that same phone inside a dry cave. No heavy rain, little sunlight, stable temperatures, very little erosion. Thousands of years later, someone might actually find pieces of it. The phone didn't survive because caves were where people always lived. It survived because caves are excellent storage rooms. Nature accidentally turned them into time capsules. Archaeologists know this better than anyone. Most ancient campsites disappear. Wood rots, leather decomposes. Plants vanish. Entire villages leave almost no trace. Open-air camps are constantly erased by weather. Wind carries away ash, floods reshape the ground. Trees push artifacts deeper underground. Season after season, nature slowly edits the landscape. Caves are different. Once something falls onto a cave floor, it often stays there. Dust accumulates, sediment builds layer after layer. Each layer quietly seals another page of history. Instead of destroying evidence, the cave protects it. It's less like a home and more like a giant archive. Imagine archaeologists 100,000 years from now. Almost every modern city has disappeared. Steel has rusted, concrete has cracked, glass has shattered. But one place remains surprisingly intact. A shopping mall built deep underground. Inside they find clothes, food packaging, furniture, children's toys, music speakers, restaurants. Would they conclude that everyone in the 21st century lived inside shopping malls? Of course not. They would recognize that the mall simply preserved evidence better than everywhere else. Yet that is remarkably close to the mistake people once made with caves. This misunderstanding shaped the public imagination. If the oldest discoveries came from caves, then caves must have been where prehistoric people lived. It seemed obvious, except archaeology kept improving. As excavation techniques became more sophisticated, researchers began discovering something unexpected. Ancient homes, not inside caves, outside them, across plains, near rivers, along coastlines, on hillsides, beneath what had once been forests. Some were simple windbreaks made from branches. Others were circular huts built from wooden poles. Some communities constructed shelters from mammoth bones covered with animal hides. Others built seasonal camps designed to be assembled and dismantled as people followed migrating animals. These weren't people hiding underground. They were adapting intelligently to the environments around them. Think about your own life. Would you choose to live permanently inside a cold, damp cave if you had another option? Probably not. Neither would prehistoric humans. Caves had serious disadvantages. They were dark, cold, often damp, poorly ventilated, dangerous, and frequently occupied by creatures far less interested in sharing than humans were. Cave bears, hyenas, lions, leopards. Sometimes, entering a cave meant entering someone else's home, a home with teeth. So why use caves at all? Because sometimes they were incredibly useful. A cave offered immediate shelter during storms. It blocked harsh winds. It provided stable temperatures. It could serve as a temporary camp while hunting nearby. Some caves became gathering places. Others became workshops where stone tools were shaped. Some became places where the dead were buried. And a few became something even more extraordinary. Places of art, places of ritual, places whose meanings we're still trying to understand today. But temporary use is not the same as permanent residence. Stopping overnight in a hotel doesn't make you a hotel person. Seeking shelter during a storm doesn't mean you live beneath the mountain forever. Prehistoric humans understood this distinction perfectly. We've simply forgotten it. Perhaps that's because the cave fits our imagination so well. It's dark, primitive, mysterious. It makes for a perfect backdrop in films and cartoons. A cave instantly tells the audience, this is the distant past. Reality is less dramatic. Most prehistoric life happened under the open sky, around campfires, inside shelters built by human hands, following rivers, crossing grasslands, watching seasons change. The cave was only one small chapter in a much larger story. And once you realize that, something else begins to change. If they didn't spend their lives hiding inside caves, then maybe they weren't the primitive creatures we've always imagined. Maybe the real question isn't where they lived, it's how they lived. And that's where the stereotype begins to collapse completely. If prehistoric humans weren't hiding inside caves, then who were they? The answer is far less primitive than most people expect. Imagine being dropped in the wilderness with no phone, no electricity, no supermarket, no GPS, no medicine, no roads. How long would you survive? A week? Maybe 2? Now imagine someone from 30,000 years ago arriving in the exact same place. They wouldn't see wilderness. They would see a map. Every tree would tell a story. Every footprint would reveal who had passed. The wind carried information. The birds signaled danger. The clouds predicted tomorrow. The landscape wasn't confusing. It was familiar. Knowledge like that doesn't come from instinct. It comes from intelligence accumulated over thousands of generations. Our ancestors didn't survive because nature was easy. They survived because they understood it with astonishing precision. For a long time, people imagined prehistoric humans as creatures driven almost entirely by instinct. Eat, sleep, hunt, repeat. But archaeology paints a very different picture. Stone tools weren't random rocks smashed together. Many required dozens of carefully planned strikes. One mistake could ruin hours of work. Some tools were designed for cutting, others for scraping hides, others for woodworking, others for hunting. Different environments demanded different technologies. Generation after generation, those techniques improved. Knowledge wasn't simply discovered, it was taught. Which raises an obvious question. How do you teach something this complicated? Probably with language. We don't know exactly when spoken language first appeared. Words leave no fossils. Sentences don't survive underground. But language leaves behind something else: behavior, cooperation, planning, innovation. Humans coordinated hunts involving dozens of people. They traveled across enormous distances. They exchanged resources with neighboring groups. They cared for injured companions who could no longer hunt. All of this becomes dramatically easier with complex communication. Our anatomy tells a similar story. The structure of our vocal tract, the control of our breathing, the parts of our brain devoted to speech, even genetic evidence, all point toward language evolving long before civilization. Perhaps prehistoric conversations sounded different from ours. Different words, different accents, different stories. But they almost certainly weren't limited to grunts. The stereotype survives because grunting is easy to understand in a movie. Real language is much harder to imagine. And where there is language, there are families. The old image of the lonely caveman wandering through the wilderness with a club is largely a fantasy. Humans have always been social. A single person cannot easily raise children alone, cannot defend against every predator, cannot hunt every animal, cannot gather every resource. Survival depended on cooperation. Children learned by watching adults. Adults relied on elders. Grandparents passed on experience that could not be invented from scratch. Groups shared food after successful hunts. Someone cared for the sick. Someone watched the children. Someone repaired tools. Someone remembered where water could still be found during droughts. These weren't isolated survivors. They were communities. In many ways, the same communities we still build today, only smaller. Then there's something even stranger: art. At first glance, art seems unnecessary. It doesn't fill an empty stomach. It doesn't stop the cold. It doesn't chase away predators. So why does it appear so early? Deep inside caves, on carved bone, on pieces of ivory, on stone. Archaeologists have discovered paintings, engravings, beads, pendants, and tiny sculptures tens of thousands of years old. Some depict animals with astonishing accuracy. Others use abstract symbols whose meanings have been lost forever. Someone spent hours creating them, sometimes days, perhaps weeks, time that could have been spent gathering food, which means those objects mattered. Not because they helped people survive another afternoon, but because they helped people understand the world. Art suggests imagination, memory, identity, tradition, perhaps even spirituality. Long before cities, long before writing, humans were already asking questions that had no practical answer. Another reason the stereotype falls apart is that there was never just one kind of caveman. For most of human history, we weren't alone. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans occupied parts of Asia. Homo erectus survived for well over 1 million years. Other human relatives appeared, adapted, and disappeared. Sometimes they met, sometimes they competed, sometimes they even had children together. Many people alive today still carry small traces of Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA. The story of humanity isn't a straight line, it's a branching tree. Different human species experimented with different ways of surviving. Some branches ended, one continued. Ours, calling all of them cavemen, is like calling every kind of bird a pigeon. Technically, they're related, but the differences matter. So if the evidence has been telling us this story for decades, why does the stereotype refuse to disappear? Partly because it's useful. Our brains love simple stories. One hairy man with a club is easier to remember than hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution. Movies need visual shortcuts. Cartoons exaggerate. Advertisements rely on instant recognition. A cave, a club, a grunt, and everyone immediately understands the joke. Reality doesn't fit into a single image. Reality is messy, complicated, full of exceptions, but also far more interesting. There's another reason. The caveman stereotype creates distance. It allows us to imagine prehistoric people as fundamentally different, less intelligent, less emotional, less human. That idea is strangely comforting, because if they were primitive, then we must be advanced. If they were foolish, then we must be wise. If they were almost animals, then civilization must have transformed us into something entirely new, But archaeology keeps delivering the opposite message again and again. It reveals people who loved, who mourned, who created, who adapted, who cooperated, who taught their children, who buried their dead, who decorated their bodies, who looked up at the same stars we see tonight and wondered what they meant. The distance between us and them becomes smaller with every discovery. Perhaps the biggest lie about cavemen isn't that they lived in caves. Some did. For a while. The real lie is the word itself. Caveman suggests a single, primitive creature frozen in time. Reality gives us something much richer. Millions of individuals, dozens of cultures, multiple human species, hundreds of thousands of years of innovation, adaptation, and imagination. People who were not waiting for civilization to make them human, they already were. Civilization didn't create intelligence, it accumulated it. It didn't invent curiosity, it inherited it. Every scientific breakthrough, every work of art, every city, every book, every spacecraft exists because countless generations before us solved problems we will never even know existed. They crossed frozen landscapes without maps, raised families without modern medicine, remembered landscapes without written language, built knowledge without schools, and passed it all forward, including to us. The next time someone says caveman, picture something different. Not a dim-witted brute dragging a club through the mud. Picture a parent teaching a child how to shape stone, an artist pressing pigment against a cave wall, a storyteller surrounded by firelight as others listen in silence, a group planning tomorrow's hunt with careful thought, people whose world looked different from ours, but whose minds were already astonishingly familiar. Because when we laugh at the idea of the caveman, we aren't really laughing at strangers. We're laughing at our own ancestors. And perhaps that's the biggest misunderstanding of all.